Awesome. Thank you, Ron. Hello, everyone. My name is Brady Andrews, and I'm a pre-sales solution architect with Logicworks. We are a premier AWS partner, Microsoft Gold partner, and Azure Expert MSP. It's always a tongue twister. We provide professional and managed services for customers either looking to migrate to the cloud and taking their first steps into that journey, or maybe they're already pre-existing in the cloud and shifting from one public cloud provider to another, or maybe looking to just optimize in the public cloud space that they're already in. These are usually hyper-compliant customers with mission-critical apps. Certain frameworks like PCI, HIPAA, HITRUST, SOC 1, SOC 2, ISO 27000. These are all frameworks that we work with at Logicworks day in and day out. So these could be SaaS platforms like banking software or hospital software that from an end user perspective that we interact with every day, something like Venmo or knock on wood, MRI programs. Today, we're going to talk about how to establish a secure multi-account architecture in AWS by leveraging AWS Control Tower. So whether you are in the data center, looking to the cloud, already in the cloud, you're going to have a set of applications that are critical to the success of your business. And at scale, likely they will have different people that have different requirements for access. So a team focusing maybe on the client portal or the web app portal may have similar requirements like OS level access, Git repository access, database access, versus teams that are more on the accounting side needing just billing, or compliance needing really read-only to security tooling and log management. I do understand that, like, in a smaller deployment, there's people that wear multiple hats, and that certainly is fine. But in the interest in the principle of least privilege, if you do have multiple teams working across these different business units, it's best to have a secure and well thought out foundation of who's going to be actually touching what inside the environment. I think that sometimes the initial setup is a lot of people have admin access and it's not restricted once the environment's like built out, and it's leading to too much cross BU actions that can be taken, whether on purpose or by mistake. So it just becomes kind of a spider web of complications, whether intended or not. So traditionally, these like different workloads, whether it's like the web app application or the client portal, it could be separated out by VPC, with at the top seeing like accounting's just looking at Cost Explorer, compliance is read-only access to each of these environments. So similar to that last slide, but where this becomes a little cumbersome is when you need to start adding in not only just the production deployments, but also the different SDLC tiers like dev, UAT, stage. That can become pretty complex, especially if you are a smaller team, having to wear these multiple hats. Not to mention that you can also run into service constraints with the number of VPCs that you're configuring. Ideally, we'd want to see these things logically separated out into their own accounts, where the different prod, stage, and devs are their own accounts underneath a organizational unit. So there'd be a client portal organizational unit, a compliance OU, a web app OU, an accounting OU, so that there's no cross-stack visibility between these workloads, and then having actual separation amongst production, stage, dev. This makes sense a lot when you have like senior developers, junior developers, and different roles and responsibilities, where maybe only a select bench of people have the permissions to promote updates to production. So it's kind of safeguarding from unintended effects, or pushing updates that maybe the code wasn't reviewed and it was not correct, and it causes downtime on a critical application. So it's really eliminating that blast radius. Another great reason for having a multi-account architecture is when you are talking compliance. So if you have a giant monolith and you are just using the traditional way of doing a hub and spoke VPC environment segmentation and only using VPCs to like separate everything out, well, if you were going for something like PCI compliance or high trust, there's no hard separation amongst that workload. So the scope and the time it takes to go through that audit is much longer. So being able to like lay foundations early on of creating, hey, this is my PCI compliant account. All these adjacent services, these are not. So going through that audit process quicker, easier, it's like a main reason for having the multi-account architecture on Control Tower. So just to recap why multiple accounts in general is isolation by SDLC tier. So we talked about a little bit like if you have senior and junior developers, prod, dev, UAT, stage, those should all be separated. It shouldn't operate in a giant monolith, similar to the isolation between different workloads like the client portal, web app portal. Something that's really I touched on was the limited visibility, discoverability of workloads, and the minimized blast radius. If you have a multi-account architecture, there's not going to be cross-account access by default. If you do have a smaller bench and people wear multiple hats, you have to go create that permission. So it's not something that's going to be there by default, which is a positive. And then strong isolation for auditing data. We just covered that previously about how that can expedite the auditing process because you can separate from the start what's in scope and what's not instead of having to sift through a giant single account architecture. The need for the multi-account architecture and securing from the foundation up has been something that AWS has seen as a need in the industry previously, and that was handled with landing zones. They were very customizable. There was a pipeline you had to manage, and the problem was that it wasn't as user-friendly and predefined as Control Tower. And you're actually required to go through a partner to start the landing zones process. Whereas with Control Tower, you can go to partners that are like certified Control Tower experts, but you're not required to use someone to lay that Control Tower foundation. So it's a much more predefined, self-service, user-friendly, like modern, updated platform for using a multi-account architecture. When you do launch a Control Tower foundation, it's going to start with 4 main accounts. There's a master account where there's not going to have any workloads actually running. It's really Lambda, organizations, service catalog, and account vending machine, which under Control Tower is now account factory. A shared services account, so directory services are really common here, IAM roles, AWS config, and then a logging account, which primarily is to centralize all the logs into the S3 bucket, which can then be used underneath products like Alert Logic for log and event monitoring, and then a security account. So that can also be like your IDS solutions. With Logicworks, we also, additionally to those 4 out-of-the-box accounts, would like to set up a billing account and a network account. I like to touch on the networking one primarily because with this example, we have 2 on-prem data centers connecting to AWS with Direct Connect. We have IDS and vulnerability scanning and a security account, S3 and the logging account, some redundant Cisco CSRs in the networking account, shared service account, Active Directory, Bastion hosts, or really that networking account is going to be like a centralized front door so that before traffic can come into, let's say, your application accounts, that traffic is monitored for anomalies and threat detection. So before it even can get to the stack, it's been ensured that it's in a good state. We touched a little bit early on the account vending machine, now the account factory. Really, this is going to be when you're scaling up and let's say you're migrating, you already have 2 applications in the cloud and you want to migrate something from the data center to stand up a new application. With the account factory, with service catalog, Lambda, organizations, and it can either be CloudFormation or Terraform. You can create these stack sets, but also like this templatized version of your guardrails that you want to apply to future account growth. So the time that it takes to stand up new accounts and create a, let's say, a PCI compliant account for your new application, that is much, much faster with Account Factory. Another great use case for the multi-account architecture is if you're a SaaS platform. If you're a single tenant SaaS platform and you need to have separate resources for each customer, you can actually create separate accounts for each of these customers. So from a isolation perspective, that's great. But from a chargeback perspective, that's really great because we can see, okay, customer account 1 charged $892, customer account 3 charged $119. I also like to think that this applies elsewhere. So if you're using different SDLC tiers and you have some dev account or a test account that has $35 worth that you're like, that should have been decommissioned, like that should not have been long standing. It's also a great way to wrap your hands around the environment to make sure that there's not any resources that are still running that should have been decommissioned. So outside of just the single tenant SaaS chargeback visibility, also understanding like what maybe is running that shouldn't be running, that we're being billed for. It's a great way to almost use it as like a cost dashboard. Quick case study I wanted to run through was with a mortgage bank. They had a limited staff, which is a primary driver of why someone comes with Logicworks. They had a PCI compliance framework they wanted to follow. They did not want to disrupt their existing CI/CD pipeline, and they lacked internal experience in security and compliance. A lot of times we see that someone new steps into a role and they weren't the ones that previously had built the environment, and they want some help understanding like, are there known gaps? So maybe we do a well-architected review and go through security, reliability, performance, costs, operations, and get a holistic view of maybe where are some known gaps. And then there's a discovery, assessment, design, and build process to stand up maybe what we did discover with Mortgage Bank into a control tower environment with PCI best practices. We implemented 24/7 support, patching, backups, incident response, as well as regular engineering reviews moving forward. And really it allowed them to shift 100% of their time towards developing their application, like new product features, instead of keeping the lights on and keeping the infrastructure running. Another example of that is, let's say they're using SSM, CloudWatch, AlertLogic, different agents in their instances. Well, when those agents stop responding or they fail, having an automated backend to replace or reboot an instance to ensure that that agent is actually functioning as we want it to, and that like the alert logic is actually making those API calls. Having an automated approach to that at scale, that's really helpful. So having a manual process instead would just be too cumbersome. You would not have any time to focus on development. So that's what Mortgage Bank was able to do, is shift their focus completely to their application. So they reduced not only infrastructure costs by 10%, but also the in-house staffing of kind of the infrastructure maintenance, keeping the lights on by over 80%, which is great. In summary, for Control Tower, it is the new version, the platform as a service version of landing zones. I really like the templatized version of when you are growing, having a governance through automation. So standing up compliant ready environments before migrating your data to that cloud. You should carefully evaluate whether or not to go to a control tower, or if at the scale of your environment, if you can achieve the isolation just through VPCs. I touched on earlier that that was the traditional way of doing it. I'm not one to break traditions. I think that you can certainly use just multiple VPCs as a way of segmenting out the environment. But if you don't have the small team that's wearing multiple hats and you do have those separate BUs, you do have some workloads that are PCI compliant maybe and some that are not, These are all driving reasons to consider control tower architecture. Logicworks is a built on control tower partner. We're really involved in shifting from landing zones to control tower and what sort of services and improvements were made in that transition. We regularly do Azure migrations, AWS migrations, even well-architected reviews. So a lot of consultation as well. We ourselves are audited for HIPAA, HITRUST, PCI, SOC 1, SOC 2, ISO, you name it. So I appreciate the time. I'll stop sharing my screen now so I can actually see the chat because it disappeared on me. But yep, thank you so much for your time. And if you have any questions, feel free to reach out. My email is bandrews@logicworks.net. So I'd be happy to speak with you guys and talk through the infrastructure.